The church sat at the edge of town like it had grown there by accident, weathered boards leaning slightly, white paint dulled by decades of wind and sun. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and old hymns, the kind of place where joy rarely lingered long. Caleb Hart stood near the altar, his broad shoulders stiff beneath a borrowed jacket that didn't quite fit right. His hat was clenched in his hands, fingers tight around the brim, knuckles pale. He had faced stampedes, droughts, and angry creditors without flinching, yet this moment made his chest feel strangely hollow. The pews were filled, though not with celebration. People came out of curiosity more than kindness. Whispers floated like gnats, soft but persistent. Everyone knew why this wedding was happening. The Hart Ranch, once proud and sprawling, was choking under debt. Caleb had tried everything, longer hours, selling off cattle, swallowing his pride, but numbers didn't bend for grit. Then there was Margaret Wells. Quiet Margaret, plain Margaret, the woman no one courted, the one people pitied with sad smiles and lowered voices. She had savings left by an aunt and no prospects of her own. This marriage solved two problems at once, and the town treated it like a bargain struck at a market. When Margaret entered, there was no dramatic hush, no intake of breath. She walked slowly, carefully, as if each step mattered. Her dress was simple, cream-colored and neatly pressed, stitched by her own hands late at night by lamplight. There were no flowers woven into her hair, just tidy pins holding it back from her face. She kept her eyes forward, chin lifted just enough to suggest dignity, though her heart was racing. She felt every stare, every unspoken judgment pressing in on her like weight. She had lived with those looks for years. They hurt less now, dulled by familiarity. Caleb glanced at her only briefly, then looked away. He told himself it was better this way. If he didn't look too closely, didn't think too deeply, he could get through this like any other hard task. Say the words, sign the papers, save the ranch, feel nothing. Margaret noticed the distance immediately, the space he left between them even when they stood side by side. It stung, but she did not let it show. She had agreed to this marriage with clear eyes. Affection was not part of the bargain. The preacher's voice echoed through the room, steady and practiced. The vows felt heavy in Caleb's mouth, each promise sounding larger than he had intended. When Margaret spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. She meant the words in the only way she knew how, not as a dream of romance, but as a commitment to do her part, whatever that might require. Their hands met, awkward at first. His was rough, scarred from years of work. Hers was warm, steady. For a brief second, he felt something unexpected, a grounding presence, calm and solid, but he pushed it aside as nerves. When the ceremony ended, there was no applause, just polite murmurs. Outside, the sun was sharp and unforgiving, the sky wide and empty. A few townsfolk offered congratulations that sounded more like condolences. Margaret accepted them with a small nod and a composed smile. Caleb hitched the wagon without a word, movements efficient and distant. He helped her climb up, careful not to linger, then took his seat, flicking the reins. The horses started forward, carrying them away from the church and toward a future neither had truly chosen. The ride to the ranch stretched long and quiet. The road cut through open land, fields rolling out toward the horizon. Wind tugged at Margaret's dress, carrying the smell of dry earth and grass. She clasped her hands in her lap, watching the scenery pass, wondering what kind of life awaited her. Caleb kept his eyes ahead, jaw set. He felt her presence beside him like a question he wasn't ready to answer. The ranch house came into view at last, sturdy but worn, its porch boards faded and steps creaking underfoot. It was not grand, but it was honest, built by hands that expected it to last. Margaret took it in with quiet attention, noting the cracked window pane, the sagging fence, the weeds pushing up near the door. She didn't comment. Instead, she stepped down from the wagon and smoothed her skirt, as if she were arriving at a place she meant to care for. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and dust. Caleb set her small trunk near the bedroom door and stood there, unsure of what came next. "You can take whichever side you want," he muttered, gesturing vaguely. It wasn't unkind, just awkward. "Thank you," Margaret replied. She unpacked slowly, placing her few dresses in the dresser, folding them neatly. She laid out her sewing kit, her books, the framed photograph of her aunt. The room felt empty, but not unfriendly. From the kitchen came the sound of Caleb moving about, restless, unsure of his own space now that it was shared. Margaret tied on an apron without asking and began to clean. She swept the floor, wiped down the table, and set a pot on the stove using ingredients she'd brought with her. The motions were familiar, grounding. Work had always been her refuge. When the stew began to simmer, the smell filled the house, warm and comforting. Caleb paused in the doorway, surprised. He had expected tension, perhaps even resentment. Instead, there was this quiet competence, this sense that things were being put in order without complaint. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though he wasn't sure why. "I know," she answered gently. They ate in near silence, the clink of spoons loud in the small kitchen. Caleb realized he hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the exhaustion in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged now that the day was done. She said nothing, offering no advice, no questions. She understood that some people needed space before they could accept kindness. That night, when the house settled into stillness, Margaret lay awake listening to the wind brush against the walls. This was her new life, built not on love, but on necessity and quiet resolve. She did not cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and promised herself she would make this place better, one small act at a time, whether anyone noticed or not. Morning came softly to the ranch, pale light creeping through the thin curtains and spilling across the wooden floor. Margaret was awake before the sun fully rose, lying still for a moment as she listened to the quiet sounds of the house. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed, and cattle lowed in the distance. This place was unfamiliar, yet something about its rhythm already felt steady, like a heartbeat she could learn. She rose carefully, dressed, and slipped into the kitchen without waking Caleb. She found coffee grounds in a tin, measured them by instinct, and soon the familiar scent filled the air. She kneaded dough with practiced hands, the motion calming her thoughts. When Caleb finally came in, hair tousled and eyes tired, he stopped short at the sight of her standing there, sleeves rolled up, sunlight touching the edges of her hair. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she replied, setting a plate on the table. He sat without argument. That surprised him most of all. Life on the ranch usually felt like a fight, against weather, money, time. Yet here was breakfast ready, warm and quiet, without expectation or comment. He ate more than he meant to, and when he looked up, he found Margaret watching him with a small, unreadable smile. Days settled into a pattern neither of them announced but both followed. Margaret learned quickly, asking few questions but remembering every answer. She kept the books, stretching coins further than Caleb thought possible, noticing mistakes he'd been too exhausted to see. She mended clothes and fences with the same care, as if everything deserved attention. When hired hands came by, she greeted them kindly, listening to their worries, remembering names. The ranch began to feel less like a burden and more like something alive again. Caleb noticed her in fragments at first. The quiet hum she made while working. The way she paused to watch the horizon just before dusk, as if listening to something only she could hear. He noticed that the house felt warmer at night, not from the fire, but from her presence moving through it, steady and sure. He didn't know when he started looking for her when he came in from the fields, only that it felt wrong when she wasn't immediately in sight. One afternoon, a storm rolled in faster than expected. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and thunder cracked sharp and close. Caleb was out repairing a gate when a horse spooked, knocking him hard into the mud. Pain flared up his side, stealing his breath. He managed to calm the animal and make his way back toward the house, soaked and shaking. Margaret saw him through the window and was at the door before he could knock. She didn't panic. She guided him inside, sat him down, and fetched clean cloths. Her hands were firm but gentle as she cleaned the scrape along his ribs. Caleb hissed once, then went quiet. He realized he trusted her completely in that moment, trusted the calm in her eyes. "You should rest," she said. He wanted to argue, but instead he nodded. Later, lying on the bed, listening to rain pound the roof, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. He had never been cared for like this without being made to feel weak. The town was slower to change. Whispers followed Margaret when she came to the market. Some women smiled politely, others with thinly veiled pity. Men nodded at Caleb with knowing looks, as if he'd made a clever deal. Margaret carried herself the same way regardless, chin level, voice soft. She didn't correct them, she didn't defend herself. Her strength was quieter than their judgments. One evening, Caleb returned from town angry, boots heavy on the porch. He dropped into a chair, jaw clenched. Margaret set a cup of coffee beside him without asking. "They still talk," he muttered. "I know," she said. "I should say something." She met his eyes then, calm and steady. "Only if you want to. Not for me." That stopped him cold. He realized she had never once asked him to choose her publicly, never demanded affection or defense. She simply stood beside him, unwavering. Something in his chest tightened, sharp and sudden. Winter came hard, but the ranch endured. Bills were paid on time. Repairs were made. Evenings were spent side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like rest. Caleb began to share stories without meaning to, about his father, about his fears for the land. Margaret listened, really listened, and never tried to fix him. One night, as they sat by the fire, snow pressing against the windows, Caleb realized he was watching her hands as she sewed, the concentration in her face. The word, old maid, floated through his mind, and for the first time, it made him angry. The town had been blind. He had been blind. I was wrong about you, he said suddenly. Her needle paused. About what? About everything. She didn't smile, didn't tease. She simply nodded, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive at that truth on his own. Spring broke through the cold like a promise kept. Green returned to the fields, calves were born strong, and the ranch breathed easier. One evening, Caleb found Margaret standing by the fence, watching the sunset paint the sky. He walked up beside her, close enough that their arms brushed. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. This time, there was no hesitation, no sense of duty. Just choice. She looked at their joined hands, then up at him, eyes soft but searching. I didn't plan this, he said quietly. But I don't want a life without you in it. Margaret's breath caught, just once. Neither do I. Love didn't crash into them like thunder. It settled, warm and certain, built from shared days and quiet understanding. They had been forced into a marriage shaped by necessity. What they created together was something stronger, a partnership rooted in respect, growing slowly and deeply, like the land they tended side by side.